Your grand-mère in Saint-Georges-de-Beauce kept a cast-iron pot on the wood stove from Saturday morning until Sunday supper. She had a rule about it. You did not lift the lid before the second mass bell rang. What most people miss about rural Quebec cooking is that the rules mattered more than the recipes. Number 14 on this list earned a name so profane the parish priest pretended he had never heard it. Number 16 took 7 hours and a 6-layer crust. Number 22 on this list was born in 1929 and ended up on the Slow Food Arc of Taste. These 25 dishes were designed for one thing: feeding a family that worked the land before sunrise and still had energy to chop wood after dark. Subscribe before this list ends. Here are the 25 lost French-Canadian country dishes that defined our heritage. Number 25, soupe à l'oignon gratiné. The rural version, the one your grand-mère made when the cellar was almost empty in March. She pulled the last 3 onions from the wooden bin, sliced them thin on the cutting board near the window, and let them brown in pork fat for almost an hour until they turned the color of old leather. She poured in beef broth from a Sunday roast that was 3 days gone, dropped in a stale heel of Cretons sauced bread, and grated whatever cheese the dairy had sent that week. No Gruyere, no labels, no white tablecloths, just an old enamel bowl, a fork to break the bread crust, and the smell of caramelized onion that filled a 4-room farmhouse for the rest of the day. Children remember the bowl more than the recipe. That was the whole point of a country soup in late winter. It said the cellar was empty and the family was still here. Number 24, Cretons. A glass jar of pinkish-brown pork spread sat on the breakfast table beside the toast and the strawberry jam. Every morning of your childhood, no exceptions. Your grand-mère ground the pork shoulder herself, simmered it in milk with onions, and ground cloves for 2 hours until it looked like a sandy paste, and packed it into mason jars with a thin white fat seal on top. The cloves were the secret. Without them, it was just pork. With them, it tasted like every Quebec kitchen between 1930 and 1985. You spread it cold on toast. You ate it with a soft boiled egg. You packed it into your father's lunch pail with a slice of yellow cheese. Cretons did not announce itself. It was simply there. The way the rosary on the wall was there. The way the hum of the wood stove was there. The day a family stopped making Cretons was the day something quiet ended. Number 23rd, Fèves au lard. Saturday night beans simmered overnight in a brown earthenware pot with salt pork, dry mustard, molasses, and a generous pour of dark amber maple syrup from the family's own sugar bush. Your grand-père lit the wood stove before going to bed, banked it low, and the beans cooked themselves until dawn. By morning, the kitchen smelled like smoke, sweetness, and pig fat, and Sunday breakfast was the leftover beans on toasted bread with a dollop of Cretons on the side. The molasses and maple gave the beans a sweet, savory crust that no American baked bean ever matched. Catholic families ate them on Saturday, so the Sabbath cook had less work, and binaries opened all over rural Quebec serving nothing else. The recipe was beans, salt pork, molasses, maple, mustard, and onion. That was it. That was the whole shopping list. Beans built a province. Number 22, Pouding chômeur. The unemployed man's pudding, invented by female factory workers in Montreal in 1929, when the stock market had just collapsed and a family had nothing left in the pantry but flour, brown sugar, water, and hope. The women mixed a thin batter, spread it in a pan, poured boiling sugar water over the top, and shoved it in the wood stove. What came out was a golden cake floating on a thick caramel sauce that tasted like it had cost $1 to make. It cost a few cents. By the 1950s, when work returned and money came back, rural grand-mères started swapping the brown sugar syrup for boiling maple syrup from the family's sugar shack. The Slow Food Foundation eventually placed Pouding chômeur on its arc of taste. The dish that was named for unemployment became the one Canadians put on a wedding table. Number 21. Tarte au sucre. A 9-inch pie shell filled with brown sugar, heavy cream, an egg, and nothing else, baked until the surface cracked into a pale toffee crust. Your great-aunt in Lotbinière kept a tarte au sucre under a tea towel on the sideboard from Friday until Sunday, and any cousin who walked into the kitchen got a sliver, no questions asked. The earliest versions used maple syrup because brown sugar was rare in colonial Quebec, but by the 1950s, most rural cooks made it with cassonade because it was cheap and predictable. Each slice was so sweet, your teeth hummed for a quarter of an hour after. Children fought over the corner pieces where the sugar had pooled and burned to a near candy. There was no chocolate, no fruit, no whipped cream. There was sugar, cream, and the patience to wait for the crust to set. The pie that asked for nothing fancy outlived every fancy thing. Number 20. Tarte au sirop d'érable. The maple syrup pie, the one that came out of the oven only during the spring sugar season when the buckets on the maple trees were running heavy. Your grand-mère used grade B amber syrup because the cheap dark stuff had the strongest flavor, whisked it with cream and an egg, and poured it into a flaky pie shell rolled out on a flour-dusted oilcloth. 40 minutes in the wood stove, and the pie came out trembling, almost too sweet to eat, the color of brown autumn leaves. A sliver was enough. A whole slice put a grown logger to sleep. The pie was never meant for company. It was the cabane à sucre dessert, the one a family ate standing in the snow outside a wooden shack while the steam from the evaporators rose into the cold air. The taste of March in a single fork. Few grand-mères still bake it the old way. Number 19. Ragoût de pâtés de cochon, pig stew. Ottawa Valley winter, 1958. Your great-grandmother singes the hair off 4 pigs' feet over a candle on the stovetop, the way her own grand-mère taught her in a stone house outside Trois-Rivières. The smell is acrid and unmistakable, and any city cousin who happens to walk through the kitchen door turns around and walks back out. She does not stop. She rinses the feet, drops them into a pot of cold water with onion, salt, and a tied bouquet of summer savory, and simmers them for 3 hours until the meat slips off the bone and the broth turns to a pearly gray gelatin. Then comes the second act. She browns flour in a cast iron pan until it smokes the color of caramel, the trick that gives the stew its deep mahogany sauce. She rolls a pound of seasoned pork into meatballs the size of plums, dusts them in the toasted flour, and drops them into the gelled broth. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and a whisper of pepper, the same spices her ancestors brought from Normandy, in a tin tied with twine. The pot simmers for another 2 hours until the kitchen window fogs over and the smell pulls every grandchild in from the snowbanks outside. The first documented recipe for this stew appeared in a Quebec cookbook in 1840, more than a century before any food blogger discovered it. By the time a single bowl reaches the table on Christmas Eve, it has been almost 12 hours in the making, and a family of 14 will leave nothing behind but bones and flour-stained spoons. The stew that took half a day to make outlived 3 world wars and a seismic shift in how Canadians cook. The grand-mères who still know the trick of singeing the hair are now in their 90s. When they go, the smell goes with them. Number 18. Ragoût de boulettes. The cousin of pâté de cochon, the one a rural cook made when the pig was already butchered and there were no feet left in the cellar. Your grand-mère mixed ground pork with onion, allspice, cloves, and a fist of soaked bread, rolled it into meatballs the size of small apples, browned them in lard, and simmered them in a deep brown gravy made from the same toasted flour trick. Boulettes were the everyday version, served on a Wednesday after a long day in the field, ladled over mashed potatoes with a spoonful of green tomato chow chow on the side. A grand-père from Mauricie would pour the gravy over a slice of bread and call it the best part of the meal. The boulettes themselves were dense, spiced, slightly sweet from the cinnamon, and they reheated better the next day than they tasted the first night. Most rural Québécois children ate this stew at least once a week between 1940 and 1980. Today, it is hard to find outside a grand-mère's kitchen. Number 17. Tourtière du Lac-Saint-Jean. Not the small pie from Quebec City, not the spiced ground meat under a flat crust. This was the deep dish version from the Saguenay, the one that fed 12 people at a réveillon table on Christmas Eve. Your great-aunt in Alma started it at 4 in the morning. Cubes of pork, beef, and whatever wild game your great-uncle had brought home were layered in a heavy cast-iron pot with cubed potatoes, onions, and broth. A thick crust sealed the top, and the pot went into the oven for 6 full hours at low heat, until the meat fell apart and the potatoes melted into the gravy. The Charlevoix settlers brought the original recipe to the Saguenay around 1838, and by the Second World War, every family in the region had its own version. A grand-mère would defend her tourtière the way another grand-mère defended her rosary. The pie came out at midnight after Mass, served with a tomato ketchup made from the garden in August, and a single slice could feed a logger for 2 meals. Number 16. Six-pâtes, or six-pâtes, or sea pie, depending on which side of the St. Lawrence your family lived on. A Dutch oven layered with up to 6 different meats, each layer separated by a sheet of pastry, slow cooked for 7 hours until the whole pot turned into a single tender mountain of game and crust. The Beauce version used moose, hare, partridge, veal, pork, and beef when a hunter had a good fall. The Gaspé version used whatever the sea had given that week. The pastry layers absorbed the broth from the meat above them and the fat from the meat below, so by the 7th hour, the crusts were no longer crusts, but soft, savory, almost custard-like sheets. A grand-père from Sainte-Marie said he could tell which household had made a six-pâtes by the smell drifting out of the chimney on a January afternoon. The dish required a hunter, a baker, and a patient wood stove. Most modern kitchens have only one of the 3. Number 15. Soupe aux pois jaunes. The Friday soup, made with whole yellow peas, a chunk of salt pork, a carrot, an onion, and dried summer savory crumbled between the fingers of a grand-mère who had been making it for 60 years. It simmered for 3 hours until the peas gave up and turned the broth into a thick golden porridge. The Québécois were so identified with this soup that English Canadians used to call them pea soupers, half mockery and half compliment. The salt pork came out at the end, sliced thin, and went on a piece of buttered bread on the side. Catholic families ate it every Friday during Lent for the same reason they ate canned salmon. No meat in the broth was the rule. A whole pot cost almost nothing and fed a household of 9 people 2 meals. The dish kept colonial families alive through a winter when the ship from Europe did not arrive on time, and most Quebec grand-mères still know the recipe by heart. Number 14. Oreilles de Christ. Christ's ears, the locals called them, and the parish priest pretended he had not heard the name when a farmer shouted it across the sugar shack on a Sunday morning in March. The dish was deep-fried smoked pork jowl, sliced thin, and dropped into a cast-iron pan of bubbling lard until it puffed up and curled into the shape of a small ear. Sugar shack workers ate them straight from the pan with maple syrup poured on top, while the steam from the evaporators outside fogged every window of the cabane. The salt of the smoked jowl, the crackle of the deep-fried fat, and the warm maple syrup made a single bite that no modern cook has matched. The name was vulgar, and the priest knew it. The dish was holy, and the workers knew that too. Most cabanes of sucre still serve oreilles de Christ during sugaring season, but the version your great-grandfather ate in 1947 came from a hog the family had raised themselves. Number 13. Soupe au gourgane. The marsh bean soup from Charlevoix and the Saguenay, the one nobody outside those two regions had ever tasted before the highways were paved. Your grand-mère grew the gherkin beans in her own kitchen garden because nobody sold them at the village store. She shelled them on the back porch in late August, dried them on a sheet for the winter, and made the soup whenever a beef shank came through the kitchen. The broth was thick with pearl barley, salted bacon, carrot, fat cabbage, and a few of the bean shells thrown in for color. She seasoned it with summer savory and chives from the kitchen window. The recipe was never written down. It passed from a grand-mère to a daughter to a granddaughter at a kitchen table over 3 generations, and even now the soup tastes wrong if you make it from a cookbook. The gourgane bean is rare today. The soup is rarer. Number 12. Tête de fromage, Christmas head cheese. The small bowl of pearly gray gelatin on every Revlon table, from Trois-Rivières to Rimouski. Your great-aunt simmered a pig's head with pork hocks and veal shanks for almost 6 hours, picked the meat off the bones with a fork, and packed it into small bowls with the cooking liquid that gelled overnight in the cold pantry. By Christmas morning, her fridge held a dozen bowls, each one wrapped in a tea towel, ready to be handed out as gifts to neighbors, the parish priest, and the cousin who had driven up from Sherbrooke in a snowstorm. She served it cold on rye crackers with a turn of the pepper grinder. The flavor was clean and rich and slightly gamey, and a single bite tasted like every December before yours. By the 1980s, most rural butchers stopped selling pig heads, and tête de fromage began its slow vanishing. The grand-mères who still know the trick are mostly working from memory now. Number 11. Pâte chinoise. 3 layers in a glass casserole dish, in this exact order from bottom to top. Ground beef seasoned with onion, salt, and pepper, browned in a heavy pan until the fat ran clear. A middle layer of canned cream corn, sometimes mixed with whole kernels for texture. The cans a household kept stacked in the cellar for the months when the garden was buried under snow. Then a final layer of mashed potatoes whipped with butter, and a splash of warm milk, smooth flat with the back of a spoon, and cross-hatched with a fork so the peaks would brown in the oven. The dish came out of the wood stove an hour later, the corn bubbling at the seams, the potatoes golden, the beef hidden but smelling of supper. Quebec grand-mères served it with a spoonful of homemade ketchup made from the garden tomatoes she had jarred in September, and a glass of cold milk for the children. Origin of the name is one of the strangest mysteries in Canadian food history. The most popular story claims it was invented in the 1880s to feed Chinese railway workers building the Canadian Pacific, but the researcher Jean-Pierre Lemasson found that those workers actually ate rice and soybeans. Another theory traces the name to South China, Maine, a small town where a similar layered dish was served in the lumber camps. The first confirmed appearance of pâté chinois in a Quebec home is the 1930s, not the 1880s. The history is fog. The dish is not. 3 layers, no spices beyond salt and pepper, ready in an hour, and almost every Quebecois child born between 1940 and 1990 ate it on a Tuesday night with the rosary on the wall and the radio murmuring in French. Number 10. Boudin noir. The Sunday morning blood sausage was made the day after the family pig was butchered in November, when the men were still washing their hands in the snow outside and the kitchen smelled of iron and onions. Your grand-mère caught the warm pig's blood in a pail, cooled it carefully, and stirred it into a mixture of chopped onions cooked slow in lard, a measure of cream, salt, pepper, and a small spoon of allspice. She poured the mixture into the cleaned hog casings her husband had prepared, tied them off into rings, and gently poached them in a pot of water kept just below a simmer until they turned a deep mahogany. Sunday breakfast was a thick slice of boudin pan fried with onions, served on toast with a soft fried egg on top. Children either loved it or hated it. There was no middle ground. The dish came directly from rural Normandy, with the first French settlers in the 1600s, and survived almost unchanged for 300 years. Today, few rural butchers will make it, and fewer grandchildren ask. Number 9. Bouillie de légumes du jardin. The garden boiled dinner, made every September when the kitchen garden was overflowing and the cellar shelves were starting to fill. Your grandmère threw a chunk of salt pork or a beef shank into the largest pot in the house, covered it with cold water, and added every vegetable the garden could give her that week. Carrots pulled that morning, potatoes the size of a fist, a green cabbage from the back row, yellow turnip, parsnip, a few small onions, and a fistful of green beans tossed in at the last hour. 3 hours of slow simmer, and the pot was a steaming mountain of vegetables and meat that fed a family of 10 with leftovers for the next day. Bouillie was the dish that said the harvest had been good, the cellar was filling, and winter would not be hungry. She served it on a deep platter with the broth in a separate bowl, a knife of butter on the potatoes, and a turn of black pepper. The vegetables tasted of soil, weather, and the work of the family that had grown them. No bouillie ever tasted the same twice. Number 8. Saumon en boîte. The Friday night canned salmon supper was a Catholic household ritual all over rural Quebec until the Second Vatican Council relaxed the meatless rule in the 1960s. Your grandmère opened a tall can of pink salmon, drained the brine, mashed the fish in a bowl with the soft bones still in it for the calcium, and folded in chopped onion, a heavy spoon of mayonnaise, and a turn of pepper. Some families ate it on a slice of buttered bread. Others piled it on a bed of warm boiled potato. There was no recipe card. The whole supper cost less than $1 and took 15 minutes. The grandmères called it the meal that reminded the family it was Friday, and the fish itself reminded the household it was a fasting day, even if the cook had not opened the calendar. The dish vanished from most Quebec tables by 1980, replaced by frozen fish sticks and tuna casseroles. A few older Québécois still make it on Good Friday out of memory. Number 7. Tarte aux pommes du jardin, Grand-mère's garden. Apple pie, the one your grandmère baked every September when the Macintosh trees behind the barn dropped their fruit into the long grass and the children were sent out with a wicker basket to gather every apple that was not yet bruised. She peeled them at the kitchen table with a paring knife in one fluid motion, the peel falling in a single spiraling ribbon to the floor. Sugar, cinnamon, a small pat of butter, a dusting of flour to thicken the juice, and the apples went into a pie shell rolled out on the same oilcloth she had used since 1957. Top crust, fork crimp around the edge, 3 slits with a knife, and the pie went into the wood stove for 40 minutes. The kitchen filled with the smell of caramelized apple that no modern bakery has ever matched. The pie came out steaming, served slightly warm with a wedge of sharp cheddar from the local dairy. Apple pie with cheese was the rural Quebec compromise, 1 bite sweet and 1 bite sharp. Children remember the cheese more than the apples. Number 6. Galette à la mélasse, molasses cake. A flat round cake made with 2 cups of dark molasses, lard or shortening, flour, milk, baking soda, and a heavy pinch of cinnamon and allspice. Your grandmère mixed it in a chipped enamel bowl on the kitchen table, while the children watched the wood stove for the right color of heat. The cake baked in a flat pan for half an hour, until the top crackled and the kitchen filled with the warm spice smell of molasses and burnt sugar. She served it warm in thick squares, with a glass of cold milk for the children and a cup of bitter coffee for the adults. The cake was dark, dense, almost sticky in the middle, and it kept for a week wrapped in wax paper on the sideboard. Molasses was cheap. The spices came from a tin that lasted 6 months, and a single galette fed a family of 8 after a long Saturday of yard work. The cake that was made when fresh fruit was scarce became the cake a Québécois grand-mère baked on the coldest Sundays of January. Number 5. Pets-de-soeur. Nuns farts, the irreverent name that somehow stuck for 300 years, and that the parish priest pretended he had never heard whenever a child shouted it across the bakery. The pastry was simple, made from leftover pie dough rolled thin, spread with softened butter, a thick layer of brown sugar, and a generous shake of cinnamon. The dough was rolled into a tight log, sliced into pinwheels, and baked in a hot oven for 15 minutes until the brown sugar caramelized into a sticky sweet spiral. Some grand-mères in the maple regions use pure maple syrup instead of brown sugar, leveraging the family sugar bush. The pastries came out of the oven sticky on the bottom, crisp on the edges, and so sweet a single one was enough to send a 5-year-old running circles around the kitchen. They were the clever way a Québécois grand-mère used the trimmings from her tourtière dough, and nothing went to waste in a country household. The name was vulgar, the pastry was beloved, the combination was very Quebec. Number 4. Beignets traditionnels. Quebec donuts, the homemade rings of fried dough your grand-mère made on the first Sunday of every month and the day before any major snowstorm. Her recipe was lard, flour, sugar, eggs, milk, baking powder, and a small jolt of nutmeg. She rolled the dough on the kitchen table, cut the rings with a tin can and a smaller can for the center, and dropped them one by one into a deep pot of hot pork lard on the wood stove. Each beignet fried for 90 seconds on a side, golden brown, drained on a clean dish towel, and rolled while still warm in a paper bag of granulated sugar. The kitchen smelled like a parish bazaar by lunch. Your great-uncle would eat 6 in a sitting and call it a snack. The beignets kept on the sideboard under a tea towel for 3 days, and they were soft on the inside and crisp on the outside until the very last one was gone. No store-bought donut has ever come close. The recipe lives now mostly in faded handwriting on the back of an old greeting card. Number 3. Grand-pères dans le sirop. Grandfathers in syrup, soft dumplings of flour, butter, milk, and baking powder, dropped by the spoonful into a pot of boiling pure maple syrup until they puffed up to twice their size and turned a pale amber color. The name comes from the old joke that the dumplings were soft enough for an old grandpère with no teeth to eat, or from the idea that the grandfathers were given the easy task of watching the pot bubble while the women set the table. Either way, the dish was the Sunday dessert at the cabane à sucre during sugaring season, served hot in a wide bowl with a generous scoop of vanilla ice cream that melted on contact. The maple syrup turned into a thick caramel sauce. The dumplings absorbed the sweetness, and a child who ate 2 would not need supper for a week. Your grandpère used grade B amber syrup because the cheap dark stuff had the strongest flavor. The dish was rural, plain, and impossible to ruin. It still tastes the way March should taste in Quebec. Number 2. Grace de rôti, roast drippings breakfast spread. The pan drippings, the savory jellied pork roast fat your grandmère poured into a small ceramic dish and set on the back porch to cool overnight. By morning, it had set into a soft, pearly gray aspic with a brown layer of meat juice settled at the bottom. She spread it thick on toasted homemade bread for breakfast, with a heavy turn of black pepper and a pinch of coarse salt. The richness of the lard, the depth of the roast juice, and the crunch of the bread made one of those simple country breakfasts that lingered in a child's memory for 40 years. Your great-grandfather called it the working man's butter, and he ate it every day before walking to the woodlot at dawn. By the 1970s, The dish was already vanishing as families moved to margarine and white sandwich loaves. The graisse de rôti is now almost impossible to find outside a grand-mère's kitchen. The bread is gone too. The breakfast belongs to a Quebec that the highway map has stopped naming. Number 1. Galettes de Sarrasin. Buckwheat pancakes, the Beauce country breakfast that fed every farm family from St. George to Lac-Mégantic for 6 generations. Your great-grandmother stirred buckwheat flour with water and a pinch of salt the night before, set the bowl by the wood stove to ferment overnight, and by dawn, the batter had risen into a tangy, nutty sponge that filled the kitchen with the smell of warm grain. She poured it onto a sizzling cast-iron pan greased with pork fat, flipped each galette once with a flick of the wrist, and stacked them on a warm plate near the stove. Children drowned theirs in dark molasses or pure maple syrup from the family sugar bush. Grand-pères ate them folded around a knife of Cretons and a slice of cheddar from the dairy down the road. The buckwheat had grown in the back field. The molasses had come from the village store in a tin keg, and the syrup had been boiled down by the men in March. Most of these dishes have not appeared in a Quebec restaurant since 1985, and only a handful of grand-mères still remember how to make them properly. Some traditions vanish quietly, and others come back when a granddaughter pulls a stained recipe card out of a drawer and decides to try. If even one of these dishes was on your grand-mère's table, share which one in the comments, and tell us which town she cooked in. Six-pâtes, tété fromage, oreilles de Crise. The names alone are worth saving. Sit at the table when you eat them, the way she did. Pass the recipe to the grandchild who actually shows up in the kitchen. These dishes paused. They were waiting for someone to ask.